Today, I thought it'd be really interesting to talk about taste. What is taste? Everyone thinks that we're either in this AI doomsday or that the AI bubble is about to pop. I'm not a huge fan of generative AI. It doesn't typically work, but that doesn't mean that there aren't places that it does work. It is impossible to avoid AI in advertising now and moving forward. So this needs to be something that you're thinking about in a conversation that you're having, either with yourself or with your brand teams. And you need to make sure that you're practicing discernment when deciding how and when to use generative AI in your content. I love working with Pilot House because while we are a performance marketing agency, we really pride ourselves on caring so much about brand and creative. At Pilot House, we don't just make ads, we craft them. Every edit, every word, every scroll-stopping detail is built with purpose and care, and I truly believe that care drives creativity and creativity drives results. Our attention to both scale and brand allows us to craft strategies that deliver you short-term results while making you long-term successful, which is so important for any DTC brand. If you are curious about learning more about working with Pilot House, you can fill out a lead form at pilothouse.co and let them know you want to go on a brand new ad venture. You don't actually have to say that. You don't have to make a pun. I'm not going to force you to make a pun. Just fill out the lead form. We'd love to chat with you. Hi, welcome back to Ad-venturous, the podcast produced by DTC and hosted by me, Aves. Today, I wanted to go back to having an episode that's a little bit more conceptual and weird and out there. We're getting into Q4, we're all getting really busy, so we're going to be doing more tactical episodes and just tips and tricks on how to survive this really crazy season in all of our lives. But like I said, wanted to go back into kind of the high concept, weird vibe for this week. So today I thought it'd be really interesting to talk about taste as an idea, a commodity. What is taste? I think right now it's a really buzzy word. Everyone kind of thinks that we're either in this AI doomsday or that the AI bubble is about to pop and that every effort we've put into generative AI content has been for nothing. And I think that when there are conversations and we're kind of having them in these lines of such extreme polarity, it usually sort of breeds this like inattention to detail, which I think is starting to happen with this conversation around taste and AI. We just start to overlook plausible solutions and strategies because we're not actually having a conversation about AI anymore. We're just kind of seeing two very distinct and different ideas about the role that AI plays in content kind of constantly pitted against each other. And we see this playing out in like LinkedIn comment sections of people just going back and forth, fighting. And again, we miss a lot of the nuance of actual conversation when this happens. So yeah, I wanted to slip into the middle of this conversation and talk about something really real and tangible, which is the role that taste and discernment actually play in a world where AI interaction is sort of inevitable in advertising. I think we all know that I'm not a huge fan of generative AI. It doesn't typically work, but that doesn't mean that there aren't places that it does work. Like I have seen full generative AI concepts come to life and do really well for brands. But again, I think it's really important to tether this conversation to something that's based in reality and something that we can all control. And so taste and discernment really play a central component into these conversations about AI usage in your advertising. Taste is, in my opinion, first and foremost, a privilege. I think it's really important to recognize that, like, to be able to hold the capacity to even decide what you want to look like, how you want to present yourself, and what you want to surround yourself with, that is a privilege. And I would say that the expression of your taste is one of the real luxuries that you can have in life. It is one thing, like I just said, it's a privilege to be able to have the mental capacity and the space to decide what you like, what you don't like, what you want to surround yourself with. But it's an absolute luxury to be able to then actually action that for yourself and the world to see. Again, the expression of your taste is just such a You're so lucky if you're in that position. I count myself as being in that position. And I do feel so fortunate to be able to, yeah, surround myself with people, things, places, views that align with my tastes. And I definitely recognize that that is not the reality for everyone. I think on a personal level, to me, taste is something that is so sentimental and also very subjective. Like my own tastes as a reference point are really rooted in ideals and like iconography that have been passed down to me through the people who raised me, both like directly in the normal sense, like family, friends, but also artists whose work has impacted me over the years. Those are the people who've really driven my own tastes. And I think that taste is something that really sits at the root of our soul and our heart, and it's who we are, and it's what we love. And it's really important to remember that when we start all talking about taste and AI and who has taste, who doesn't. There's almost this like mythological quality about taste that people love to assign. We say that some people have really good taste, some people have bad taste, and we kind of allow this narrative to run rampant, like taste not being a skill, but it's just something that happens to us is really interesting to me, I think, as just a train of thought. People will say things like money can't buy taste, and then we call other people taste makers. And so, yeah, we allow it to exist in our lives as just something that happens to happen to a lucky few. We think of taste as like divine intervention instead of, like I said, it being a privilege and in some ways a skill to kind of fine tune how you're expressing your own tastes. But yeah, we really put taste on this pedestal and then kind of call it a day. And we say you either have it or you don't. And I just don't think that that is correct. And I don't think it's helpful in conversations about whether or not to use AI for your brand. So, all that being said in the intro is just to point out the fact that AI cannot and will never be capable of taste. And this is something that I feel really comfortable saying because it's just true. Like, if you look at what taste is, like I said, it's typically passed down and passed around from human to human. It's just not something AI is ever going to be able to replicate. It takes earned experience, wisdom, and humanity to fully realize taste in your own life and in your work, which is, again, just something that AI is never going to be able to do. And so I think that's why people love to throw taste into the conversation about what creative work will look like in the future as we see more and more brands using AI. But I'll get into it a little bit further in the episode. I don't think it's necessarily the number one skill that we all want to be focusing on. I wanted to do this episode, especially at this point in time, even though it is super conceptual. And like I said, I'm really into doing the tactical episodes right now to kind of help folks through Q4. But I do think, like I said, there's this weird buzzy conversation going around on taste and AI, and it's just warming up. And I like to be like an early adopter of things. I feel like that's part of me and my tastes in life is I like to get to things first. Like for example, I have been obsessed with the 1997 performance of Silver Springs for like half my life, and I was so delighted when people started talking about it on TikTok because it became like a huge talking point for me. So I'm kind of making with this episode selfishly, I guess, so that in like 4 months when people are talking about taste in abundance, I can really point to this episode and say that I was early on the trigger for this one. I've seen so many people say that taste is going to be the next big marketable skill if you are someone who works in the creative side of marketing. And I think that, again, like I've said it 1,000 times already, that conversation is really, really stupid to me because taste, in my opinion, is not a marketable skill. I'm going to go through a couple of examples of people to show you what I'm talking about, but it's just not like a bring it from business to business skill. It's so tethered to who we are. I just don't think it's a good idea to create this narrative that like taste is going to be a sellable commodity on your LinkedIn profile. It's just probably not the truth. What actually does matter moving forward is discernment. I know the word discernment is not as fun or buzzy as the word taste. It doesn't invoke really cool images in our mind, but I wanted to play these two words and what they mean and what they hold in the industry sort of against each other to show you guys what I'm talking about. So I thought it'd be really interesting to explore taste and discernment using two real life people who were both at some point played by Meryl Streep, which is I think, a really cool crossover. As a really big Meryl Streep fan, fun, interesting. The first person I'm going to talk about today is the famed American chef Julia Child, who was a special childhood interest of mine. And the second person I'm going to talk about is Anna Wintour, who is, as we know, maybe we don't know, but she is the inspiration behind The Devil Wears Prada and the woman sort of underneath one of the most famous bobs of all time, and the editor-in-chief of Vogue for 1,000 years. I'll start with Julia Child. Julia Child, like I said, special interest of mine as a kid. She was born in Pasadena, California in 1912, and she was a typical, albeit very tall, American girl raised in a very typical American household. This is like a fun little advertising crossover, but Julia Child actually worked as a copywriter for an advertising agency when she was young, and she held hopes of one day becoming an author. And spoiler alert, she did do that. She ends up becoming a published author in her lifetime. Maybe not in the way that she imagined it, but I still think it's really cool when people like have goals and then they come to them in a really roundabout way. I don't know. Another fun special interest of mine is like you wanted to do that thing and you did it, not in the way that you thought you would, but you did do it. Very fun, very cool. Such is life. Anyway, Julia Child, growing up in her youth, was not really particularly interested in food. And she also grew up in an era where food was like disgusting in America. I don't want to throw too many rocks, I guess, but yeah, food was kind of nasty at that point in time. We were really starting to come to this idea that we wanted food to be convenient. And so I think that America was on the cutting edge of a lot of that. And a lot of like weird, nasty stuff was going on that I don't really want to think about or talk about. Like meat jellies. I mean, there are some meat jellies in her cookbook, but bleh. Anyway, moving back to just sort of the timeline of her life, in 1942, she joined the OSS because this is so fun to me. She was too tall to enlist in the Women's Army Corps. She's 6'2", which is exactly the same height as my dad, which I always thought was really funny and cool growing up because that is pretty tall. And yeah, so it's so interesting that her height limited her, so she kind of pivoted to joining the OSS, which is wild. Crazy work. But she was really highly regarded by her peers. She did really good work. And it was at this time that she met her husband, Paul. And if you do the math, sort of when she was born, joining the OSS, this puts her around over 30 years old when she met her husband, which is pretty bombastic and crazy for 1942. But I think it's really sweet and romantic and kind of speaks to the person that she was and just did things in her own time. But Paul Child, her husband, really cool. If you're subscribing to this idea of good taste versus bad taste, people said that Paul had very good taste. He was also born in America, but he'd previously lived in Paris, and he was a poet, and he just enjoyed a much more sophisticated lifestyle than Julia had. Even though, again, Paul was also American. He was born in New Jersey, which is not a place that we typically correlate to good taste. I tried to say that politically so as to not offend anyone from New Jersey. But yeah, he had a very similar upbringing, but people would, at that specific point in time when they both met, probably say that one of them had good taste and one of them had bad taste. So again, just a really good example of that being a nonsense conversation. In 1948, the couple moved to France together after Paul was assigned there through work. And France, or at least the opportunities that France and Paris provided, changed Julia's life forever, and a lot of people's lives as sort of a butterfly effect situation. One of my favorite quotes from Julia is about her first time dining at a French restaurant, and she enjoyed oysters, she had fish. It was just a really different experience than what she'd eaten back at home. And she described the experience as an opening up of the soul and the spirit, which I think is exactly what it feels like when you realize that you have a taste for something. She was at this point in her late 30s. She'd never shown any kind of interest in food or cooking. And suddenly here she was, a lady who just moved to Paris, hugely fascinated and excited by food and leaning into her tastes for the first time. By 1951, she graduated from the Cordon Bleu, where she was studying privately with master chefs, but it wasn't easy. She had a difficult time, as anyone does, picking up a new skill. I think that's really worth noting that she put in a lot of work, but also it was a really joyous experience to her learning something new, which I love and I think is a lesson that we should all carry with us. Like to find a passion for something as fundamental to life and living as cooking is just a wonderful, beautiful thing. In France, she then joined a women's cooking club through which she met Simone Beck and Louisette Bertholle, who were her co-writers on her very famous cookbook, Mastering the Art of French Cooking. So the two women had already been working together on creating a cookbook, and Simone was the one who suggested that Julia join them. So to help their cookbook appeal to Americans, which is really interesting again at the time if you think about French cooking, where America was headed already when it comes to food, and this idea that we could spend more time and put more love into food was kind of foreign and different and weird. It's French cooking, if you're not a huge foodie, is rich, it's decadent, and it demands a lot of love and passion and also butter. All things that were, except for butter, mostly being erased from American cooking at the time. But the three women did do it. They wrote the cookbook. I have a copy of it somewhere in storage that I got when I was like 12 for some reason. Weird. And there is a lot of weird stuff like meat jelly, like I mentioned, but overall, it's a very solid cookbook. It's a very good foundational cookbook to have in your kitchen. And the book was such a huge success that it went on to land Julia a TV show back home in America. And I don't know if you've ever watched an episode of The French Chef, but it is one of the most comforting and entertaining cooking shows to ever exist. Because of the limitations of technology at the time, the show was really unedited. So we saw raw cooking as it kind of happens in all of our lives. It was full of mistakes and clumsiness, but it was the way that Julia would sort of spin each of those mistakes into a nice lesson and fun, light moment that really won over Americans. She didn't apologize. She didn't get upset. She just steadied herself in the kitchen, moved on, and figured out how to right whatever had gone wrong in the process of cooking. Julia Child was approachable and authentic, and through her own life showed us that taste is something that we can learn. We're not born with or without it. It's not this special, magical quality that some people have. Julia Child herself literally said, "No one is born a great cook. You have to learn by doing." And I think there's a really great lesson in that. Again, when we think about people just throwing in the towel and deciding, I don't have any taste, so I can't operate in this creative space, it's not true. Learn from Julia Child. Anyone can figure it out. It's just about getting the reps in and exposing yourself to things. I think that's the other big lesson when we look at taste in Julia Child, is that she didn't know what she liked until she was exposed to it, which again, I think is a really good way to think about what taste is and to frame what this skill of taste and what the experience is in the terms of branding and AI. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? Because like I said, you have to be exposed to things just like Julia. You have to understand what your taste is. So it's a really bad stand-in for what creative work will look like in the future. Which brings us to our next diva, Anna Wintour. Like I said, one of the most iconic bobs of all time. It's a severe bob. It's very like right at the bottom of her face, and she's got the little bangs. It's intense. It's an intense haircut for an intense woman. And I don't want to sound biased in this exploration of Anna Wintour, but I probably will because I don't really like her that much. I don't care for her vibe. So keep that in mind. Big fan of Julia Child. Love her like bon appetit attitude, joie de vivre. Love. Anna Wintour, not so crazy about, so I feel like you'll probably note that in this comparison. But yeah, if you don't know her insanely precise bob or bangs, she is a British American woman who was I'm not going to say she's the most famous editor-in-chief of Vogue because I think that erases some really interesting people, but she's probably the most well-known. She has been the editor-in-chief of Vogue since 1988, and like I mentioned, her work there inspired the role of Miranda Priestley in The Devil Wears Prada, which is a great film, fantastic. Second one coming out, amazing. But yeah, Anna herself, she was born in Hampstead in 1949 in England, and her dad was also an editor, and she grew up loving fashion, and her dad helped her make the right connections, get the right gigs early on, and really helped shape her career very early in her life and set her up in the business in a way that kind of only someone with those Nepo baby advantages can really enjoy, which is fine. We don't hate on Nepo babies around here, but it's just interesting to note that Anna Wintour didn't have to discover a taste for fashion or a taste for journalism and publications. She kind of was born into the world and then fine-tuned what she liked and what she could do within that world. So keep that in mind. One of the craziest things I learned when I was reading about her to prep for this episode is that she was 14 years old when she first started experimenting with a bob. That is insane to me. She's had that bob for so many years. 14, and you get a haircut and you don't change it. She's like 80 now. Nuts. But she first came to the US to work for a couple other publications before she returned home to be the editor of British Vogue in the 80s. That sounds like it would have been a lot of fun. It would have been a good time. And then a year later, she found herself back in the US at the helm of mainstay Vogue, which was 1983. And she's been doing that same job ever since, which is also wild. If there's one thing about Anna Wintour is she is incredibly consistent. Her first cover ever of American Vogue is pretty famous. It's really casual and light and airy and feminine in a different way that we hadn't really seen before. It featured a model in a really cool sweater and mostly sort of undone, meaning she wasn't like super glam. And she was wearing jeans, which was so different and crazy for the magazine at the time. During her time at Vogue, one thing that Anna Wintour has done exceptionally well is moments like these where she's able to mirror her reader really perfectly. The 90s were a decade that were famously very grungy, exceptionally casual, very effortless. And so her having that cover come out in 1988, I think is a testament to her skill to be able to forecast trends and decide exactly how to sort of drip feed that out through a newspaper. What's really interesting to me is Anna's trajectory couldn't be more different than Julia's, right? We've got one person who didn't discover until their very late 30s that they love something, that they had a real taste for food and cuisine and life and dining. And then we have someone else who was raised in a very particular environment who has been sort of a mainstay of that same environment for years. Anna was born into a family with connections, like I said, a family who was already established in the business, and she grew up around people who embodied what she considers good taste. It wasn't something that she had to learn. She inherited very easily what, again, she considered to be good taste. It wasn't an effort. She didn't have to realize it later in life. It just happened. It was just always part of her. Like the bob, for example. She always had the taste that she continues to have today. I feel like there's no like weird fashion girlies listening to this marketing podcast, so I'm going to speak my truth here as well. I don't think that Anna Wintour is a shining example of taste, and that's why I'm using her as juxtaposition next to Julia Child. I think that she's a really interesting and informative case study for us on discernment, and discernment at a high level. Discernment, by literal definition, means the ability to judge, which is something that Anna Wintour is known for. She's not so much about going out and doing and creating something net new, but she's mostly known for this ability, like I said with that first cover, to make a judgment and decide how to best represent something that's already going on. And that's not so much taste as it is discernment. At the time of recording this podcast, yes, Vogue has featured AI models, which I personally do see as a huge lapse in discernment. But also, again, speaking my truth, because I don't know how many fashion girlies are listening to a marketing podcast, I do think it was one of those things that they just had to try and test the waters and see how people reacted. And people did react very poorly. So that is a lesson learned. But that's going to happen when you're Vogue. You just got to try it out. I hate it personally, of course. But like I said, a lot of times you just have to test the waters. And so I do think it's really interesting to think about lapses in discernment in her career, especially sort of in the past 10 years or so when folks have really noticed that Vogue US has been flopping compared to other counterparts. I think that it speaks to that earlier point that I made that I'm not sure if taste is her skill rather than discernment. And it gets very difficult when we're only practicing discernment and no taste. But anyway, back to the original thesis of this entire episode. Anna Wintour built her legacy on discernment and not taste. And I think it's really important that we separate those two things when we start having these conversations about using AI in advertising. She was guided by shielding herself and Vogue in the process from being out of fashion, not on trend. She was guided by saying no to things rather than saying yes to things. Like I said, she wasn't necessarily creating taste in a way that we might associate with someone in her position. She was mostly just a safeguard for Vogue as an institution and for herself as an institution. And you don't do that by, again, going out and creating net new tastes and different ways of doing things. You do that by practicing discernment at a high volume and being really good at knowing what to do and when to do it. So, what does all of this conversation about two women who were played by Meryl Streep at different times have to do with your brand and AI integration? That is a great question. I recently presented a similar sort of timeline in comparison to the rest of the leadership team here at Pilot House, and they had the same question. They didn't ask directly, but I could tell by their faces that they were engaged and curious, but also a little confused, which is the perfect reaction, I think, for anything that I say ever. That's what I'm always hoping to inspire in people. But like I said at the top, people are starting to really fixate on taste as a concept and as a commodity, and are starting to talk a lot about taste and how it plugs in and plays with AI. And it's really putting pressure on brands to go impossibly far up in the funnel. And it's creating this weird and kind of confusing discourse about what is needed from creative and brand leadership in the future. But it's not going to be taste that sets you up for your success while you navigate AI integration with your brand. It's going to be discernment. And that main point is why I wanted to make this episode today. You need to be Anna Wintour level picky when deciding how and when to use AI in your content. I think that, again, when we tie this back to taste, taste is something that's so passionate and personal. And I don't think it's a great measure of skill in marketing. I think it has to come back to discernment and your ability to judge whether or not this works for your actual brand. Like I said, AI is never going to possess taste, which is why I think that people get really hyper fixated on this idea that if you have good taste, you're going to be working with AI in a different way. As we established, taste is just a very human experience and it's built on environments that we find ourselves in. But taste doesn't pay the bills, babe, unless you're Julia Child or someone else really cool. Even for Anna Wintour, taste is not the reason that she has sat at the helm of Vogue for as long as she has. It is judgment and discernment, like I said. I'm not going to tell you that generative AI is not going to work for your brand because I don't know your brand. But the one thing I can say is that it is impossible to avoid AI in advertising now and moving forward. So this needs to be something that you're thinking about in a conversation that you're having, either with yourself or with your brand teams. And you need to make sure that you're practicing discernment when deciding how and when to use generative AI in your content. An example I've used while having this discussion previously and keeping it on brand with this taste thing is celebrity chef Guy Fieri versus celebrity chef Wolfgang Puck. Both are really valid. Both are loved and celebrated chefs. They both love the same thing, which is food and dining, but they go about it in totally different ways. If I went to a Guy Fieri restaurant and I was served a chili dog, which I don't like chili and I don't eat meat, so I don't know what would happen. But if that was what I was eating and into, and that's what I was served, I'd be really excited. It would probably be one of the best chili dogs of all time. However, if I go to the Wolfgang Puck restaurant and the chef's special that I'm brought out is a chili dog, I'm gonna feel a little miffed and a little confused. It's just not what he's known for. I'm probably going to expect a beef Wellington. I don't know why all my examples are non-plant-based foods, but they are. But that is what I would expect. Something that's actually on brand for him and makes sense with the type of food that he's become famous for. And I can't stress this enough. Both are, like I said, very valid and both would be exquisite meals, I am sure. But they're just, at their core, they're fundamentally different, right? So you can't, if you're Wolfgang Puck, be serving chili cheese dogs, and if you're Guy Fieri, serving a beef Wellington would be super weird and off-brand and probably not what the people in your restaurant want to see either. And I think another good comparison for an actual sort of brand case study is thinking about Liquid Death versus Diptyque. Liquid Death is scrappy, they're disruptive, it's in their product development, it's who they are at their core. So when they produce really bonkers content that uses a lot of AI, it makes a ton of sense because the essence of their brand isn't necessarily artistry. They're not stewards of visuals, they're fun, they're subversive, they sell water in like punk rock cans. It's funny, it's a fun, novel product, it's cool. Their customers want to see their sense of humor and they want to have fun with the brand. Diptyque, however, is known for blending art and product development. It's like their entire origin story. I've talked about it on the podcast before. So if they started mass producing kind of these awareness focused content pieces with a ton of AI usage, it would be hugely disconnected from the actual ethos of their brand and would probably really piss off their existing customers who do come to them because they value that artistry and taste. So, to wrap it all up, this was a really conceptual episode at its core. Like I said, we're just starting to have this conversation around taste and AI, but I really wanted to get in early and say, let's not talk about taste. Let's start talking about discernment and the role that that plays in AI integration moving forward. Because, like I said, it's pretty inevitable that you are going to have to interact with AI in some way, shape, or form when you are working on the creative side of advertising. And so taste is not necessarily the be all, end all, and the king. It doesn't go from brand to brand. And like I said, it doesn't pay the bills unless you are doing something really specific to your taste, like Julia Child. What you need to think about is discernment and judgment and deciding if AI really works for you, like a liquid death, or if it's something that you should stay away from. But it's, again, really important to be having these conversations with yourself, with the rest of your brand team, to make sure that you're not misstepping in any way, because the poor usage of AI is not something that's easily forgiven by the public at this point in time because it's so new and because it's such a polarized topic. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it's really important that we all exercise that discernment in our work every day. I think that we all get a lot of pressure. We hear it all the time. How are we leveraging AI in our workflows? Are we using it too much? Are we not using it enough? And there's just a lot of conversation around it. And like I said at the top, it's such a polarized conversation that sometimes we miss actual nuance and really helpful strategies. They just get lost in the middle. I sometimes feel like that meme of Gabe from The Office when he's like, shut up about the sun. That is me talking about AI usage. In fact, I'm going to make that a meme and put it on LinkedIn right now, across at the sun. I think that would be very funny. That's exactly how I feel about it. But you need to have a strong foundation before you start playing around with different versions of generative AI, in my opinion. So you really need to understand things. We've talked about this on the podcast before. Like, who is your target persona? What are they looking for? It kind of goes back to that Liquid Death versus Diptyque example again. Liquid Death knows who their audience is. So when they're shipping these ads that are fully made with generative AI, they know that they're going to land well. But if you don't know who your target customer is, you don't know how they're going to respond to heavy generative AI ads. And that's a very dangerous game to be playing because you might piss people off who were interested in your brand, but now you've just put a bad taste, wink, in their mouth. So really make sure, again, you're practicing discernment, you're having these conversations, and you're just thinking through that discernment piece and really making decisions that fit in with your brand and make sense for the people who you're actually hoping to attract. That was the episode for today. Next week, we're going to be talking about how to make sure you don't get creative fatigue during Q3 and Q4. Very exciting. We're going to be talking about quick iterations, really tactical stuff again. But I hope you enjoy this episode. Like I said, a little bit more out there, wacky, fun. I hope that you watch an episode of The French Chef if you never have. Like I said, very calming, very sweet, a really good time, and a great laugh. Hopefully you subscribe already, but if you don't, subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you are curious at all about figuring out who that target persona is, figuring out what type of AI integration at all is good for you, give us a call. We'd love to chat. We talk a lot at Pilot House about personas, about who we're talking to. And you've heard me, if you've listened to any other episode, you've heard me say this. We pay a lot of attention to the language that persona uses, and we make sure that we're matching it. So we are experts in this stuff. If you're not sure, if you want a second opinion, reach out. We'd love to chat. And thanks for listening. Chat next week.